February 2021, Texas. 4 million homes without power. 700 people dead from cold-related causes in a state where the average January low is 38 degrees. The grid failed completely, and when it did, every heating system that depended on it failed with it. What didn't fail were the 12 homes in one hill country community that had installed a below-grade thermal exchange system the previous year. Total material cost per home, under $300. Total heat loss during the outage, none. 3 of those homeowners have since received cease-and-desist orders from their counties. The system works too well for certain people's comfort. The grid is not a utility. It is a dependency. Most Americans understand this abstractly, but February 2021 made it concrete in a way that no preparedness seminar ever could. When the Texas power grid failed, it did not fail partially. It failed completely, simultaneously, across the 4th largest economy in the United States. Natural gas lines froze. Electric heating coils went cold. Heat pumps stopped functioning at precisely the temperatures they were most needed. Every system that required an external energy input stopped delivering heat at the same moment for the same reason. They all fed from the same single source. That source went down. 4 million homes went cold. 700 people died. That is not a weather story. That is an infrastructure story. And the infrastructure has not changed. The average American home has exactly one heating system. That system runs on either natural gas delivered through pipes it does not own or electricity delivered through a grid it does not control. In both cases, the energy source originates somewhere else, travels through a network owned by someone else, and arrives at your home on a schedule you have no influence over. When that network is intact, it is extraordinarily convenient. When it fails, from a storm, a cyber attack, an infrastructure collapse, or a declared national emergency, you have no backup. You have a thermostat that controls nothing. The people who recognized this problem earliest were not preppers in the modern sense. They were builders, engineers, and homesteaders who understood a physical fact that predates electricity by several thousand years. The earth beneath your feet is a thermal battery. At a depth of 4 to 6 feet, ground temperature across most of the continental United States stabilizes between 50 and 56 degrees Fahrenheit. That number does not change in January. It does not change during a polar vortex. It does not change when the governor declares a state of emergency and the grid buckles under demand it was never designed to handle. 54 degrees, year-round, 12 inches below your garden. That is not body temperature. It is not comfortable indoor air temperature. But it is 25 degrees warmer than a January night in Dallas, 30 degrees warmer than a February night in Minneapolis, and in a properly designed structure, it is more than sufficient to prevent pipes from freezing, to keep a living space above the survival threshold, and to do it indefinitely, without fuel, without electricity, and without asking anyone's permission. For most of recorded human history, nobody asked permission. The Norse built into hillsides. Underground communities in Cappadocia maintained stable temperatures while surface winters dropped well below zero. The sod houses of the American Great Plains, documented extensively by the National Park Service, used earth contact on 3 sides to dramatically reduce heating loads. Root cellars, partially subterranean barns, bermed structures, these were not primitive technologies born of ignorance. They were engineering solutions to a problem that has not changed. External temperatures fluctuate wildly. Ground temperatures do not. The modern version of this principle is not complicated. It does not require an engineering degree or a construction crew. The core materials, corrugated drainage pipe, gravel, basic thermal mass elements, are available at any regional hardware supply store. The total cost for a minimum viable installation runs between $250 and $320, depending on your region and the current price of Schedule 40 PVC. The build time for a competent first-timer working alone is 1 to 2 weekends. These are not estimates from a homesteading blog. They are documented in extension service publications from 3 land-grant universities and in the construction records of intentional communities across the American Southwest that have been operating these systems, legally or quasi-legally, for decades. The phrase quasi-legally is doing important work in that sentence, and that is where this story stops being about physics and starts being about policy. Beginning in the mid-1970s, in the wake of the first energy crisis, the United States began systematically codifying home construction standards in ways that, intentionally or not, locked residential structures into utility dependency. The International Building Code, adopted in full or modified form by 49 of 50 states, contains specific provisions governing below-grade construction, insulation requirements, moisture barriers, frost line compliance, and occupancy standards that collectively make a legally permitted earth-sheltered home prohibitively expensive in most jurisdictions. Not impossible, prohibitively expensive. A below-grade installation that costs $300 in materials can trigger permit requirements, engineering review, soil compaction testing, and waterproofing inspections that add $10,000 to $40,000 to the total project cost before a single shovel breaks ground. That is not an accident of bureaucratic complexity. That is a regulatory architecture that produces one predictable outcome. People who want to reduce their dependence on grid energy cannot afford to do it legally, so they either abandon the project entirely or build without permits and live with the exposure. The 12 homes in that Texas Hill Country community that maintained heat through the entire 2021 outage were not permitted. The contractor who designed the systems knew the code. He built them anyway, documented everything, and then waited. 3 of those homeowners received county notices within 18 months of the outage, not because their systems were unsafe, not because anyone had complained, because a routine aerial survey flagged construction that did not match their permitted footprint. The question is not whether this method works. It demonstrably works. The question is whether knowing about it, building it, and using it on your own property is something the current legal framework permits you to do. In most of this country, the honest answer is not without a fight. And the nature of that fight, which states, which codes, which loopholes still remain open, is exactly what the next section covers. The mechanism is not complicated, but it needs to be stated precisely, because precision is what separates this from a folk remedy. Ground temperature stability is a function of thermal mass and solar penetration depth. The sun heats the surface layer of soil daily and seasonally, but that thermal energy dissipates rapidly as depth increases. Below 4 feet, daily surface temperature swings become statistically irrelevant. Below 6 feet, seasonal variation across most of the continental United States compresses to a range of roughly 4 to 8 degrees. The United States Geological Survey has published ground temperature profiles for major soil types across all climate zones. The numbers are consistent. At 6 feet of depth, ground temperature in the lower 48 states averages between 50 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on latitude and soil composition. That figure holds in January. It holds during a polar vortex. It held in February 2021 while 700 Texans died of cold-related causes above it. 55 degrees, year-round. The basic earth tube system, documented in extension service publications from Oklahoma State University, the University of Minnesota, and Cornell, works by moving air through buried corrugated pipe before it enters the living space. Outside air at 15 degrees enters the tube network. By the time it travels 40 feet of pipe buried at 6 feet of depth, it exits at 48 to 52 degrees. That is not a comfortable indoor temperature, but combined with minimal supplemental heat from a wood stove, body heat from occupants, or passive solar gain through south-facing glazing, it is sufficient to keep a structure well above freezing indefinitely. With zero grid input, zero fuel combustion, and zero ongoing cost after installation. The materials list for a minimum viable single-zone system: 100 feet of 4-inch corrugated drainage pipe at approximately 60 to 80 cents per linear foot, 2 cubic yards of pea gravel for the trench bed, PVC connectors, a 12-volt DC inline fan rated for continuous duty, and basic hand tools. Total material cost in most regions: $260 to $310. The fan draws less power than a refrigerator light bulb and runs indefinitely on a single small solar panel or a modest battery bank. The trench can be dug by hand over a weekend or by a rented walk-behind trencher in an afternoon. This is not new information. Earthship communities in Taos, New Mexico, have been operating earth tube ventilation systems since the early 1970s. The Hockerton Housing Project in Nottinghamshire, England, a fully documented social housing development, published thermal performance data showing ground-coupled heating reducing winter heating loads by over 60%. Viking longhouses in Norway used Burmed earth walls on 3 sides as a matter of standard construction. The Matmata underground village in Tunisia, still inhabited, has maintained stable interior temperatures for centuries, using nothing more than excavated earth and passive ventilation. These are not fringe experiments. They are documented, replicable, and in most cases performed by people with no engineering credentials and hand tools. None of that matters to the International Residential Code. IRC Section R302 governs fire separation and construction materials for below-grade spaces. IRC Section R405 covers foundation drainage requirements that apply to any below-grade installation. IRC Section N1102, the energy efficiency provisions, mandate specific insulation R values for below-grade walls and slabs in new construction, values that are genuinely difficult to achieve in an earth contact build without professional-grade waterproofing and rigid foam systems that push total costs into the tens of thousands. The frost line provisions in IRC Appendix D require foundation footings to extend below the frost line in your jurisdiction. In Minnesota, that is 42 inches. In Montana, it reaches 60 inches. A requirement that, applied to earth tube inlet and outlet structures, can trigger full foundation review by a licensed structural engineer. That review, in most jurisdictions, costs between $3,000 and $8,000 before a permit is issued. The result? A $290 materials list becomes a $30,000 permitted project, or it becomes an unpermitted installation that the homeowner builds quietly and hopes nobody notices. On the map, the legal exposure is not uniform. California requires CEQA environmental review for any below-grade construction that disturbs more than 1 cubic yard of soil in sensitive habitat zones, a category that includes significant portions of the Central Valley and coastal counties. The California Energy Code, Title 24, imposes prescriptive requirements on any new thermal system in a residence that effectively prohibit earth tube installations as a primary heating source. Violations carry civil penalties starting at $1,000 per day. New York's Energy Conservation Construction Code, updated in 2022, mirrors these provisions and adds mandatory mechanical ventilation standards that earth tube systems do not meet under current certification frameworks. Washington State adopted the 2021 International Energy Conservation Code with amendments that specifically tighten below-grade thermal exemptions that had previously existed for agricultural structures. Oregon's residential code enforcement is administered at the county level, which creates significant variation, but Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas counties, covering the Portland metro area, all enforce provisions that make unpermitted earth contact installations a code violation subject to mandatory removal orders. Mandatory removal. Not a fine, removal. Colorado presents a specific irony. The state that caps residential rainwater collection at 110 gallons has no specific prohibition on earth tube systems in its residential building code. but its county-level enforcement in the Front Range corridor, from Fort Collins through Colorado Springs, is aggressive enough that any unpermitted below-grade construction triggers automatic review. The enforcement gap opens dramatically east of the Continental Divide in unincorporated rural counties where building departments are understaffed, inspection resources are limited, and the practical reality is that nobody is driving 60 miles down a county road to investigate a trench. That gap between the law on paper and the law as enforced is the most important variable in this entire analysis. Not yet is not never, particularly with respect to Federal Energy Emergency Authority. Under the Defense Production Act and Executive Order 13,603, the federal government retains the authority to regulate energy resources and infrastructure during declared national emergencies. That authority has never been applied to individual residential thermal installations. The legal framework exists, and in a world where grid stability is increasingly described in national security terms, the distance between never applied and applied may be shorter than it appears. The 5 most restrictive states for earth contact and off-grid thermal installation are not the 5 most obvious ones. California leads, as it leads in most categories of residential energy regulation. But the ranking below it contains surprises that matter depending on where you live. Number 5, Massachusetts. The state's stretch energy code, which most municipalities have adopted above the base IRC requirements, imposes below-grade installation minimums that are among the strictest in the nation. Any below-grade thermal installation in a new or modified structure triggers a HERS rating review, a home energy rating system assessment performed by a certified rater costing between $300 and $800 before a certificate of occupancy is issued. The saving grace is geography. West of Worcester, in rural Franklin and Hampshire counties, enforcement capacity is limited and permit applications for agricultural outbuildings, which carry exemptions from the stretch code, are processed by departments that frequently lack the staff to conduct detailed inspections. The agricultural outbuilding exemption is real, functional, and underutilized. Number 4, Washington State. The 2021 IEC adoption with state amendments eliminated the agricultural exemption pathway for thermal installations that had existed in the 2018 code cycle. That exemption had allowed earth contact systems on parcels with documented agricultural activity to bypass the prescriptive energy efficiency requirements. Its removal was not announced prominently. It disappeared in a table in Appendix A of the amendment package. The practical effect, in Washington, the lowest friction legal path for a ground-coupled system now runs through a licensed mechanical engineer's stamp on a performance path compliance form. That stamp costs money. On the eastern side of the Cascades, in Ferry, Stevens, and Pend Oreille counties, enforcement is functionally absent. Same state, different planet. Number 3, New York. The combination of the 2022 Energy Conservation Construction Code update and New York City's Local Law 97, which technically applies only to buildings over 25,000 square feet, but has created a regulatory climate that filters down to residential code interpretation across the metropolitan area, makes any non-standard thermal system an administrative challenge. The escape valve is documented and well established. North of Albany, in the Adirondack periphery, the southern tier, and the Finger Lakes agricultural zones, Amish and Mennonite communities have built decades of legal precedent for off-grid thermal installations under First Amendment accommodation frameworks. That precedent does not automatically extend to non-community members, but in the right jurisdiction with the right legal counsel, it has been successfully applied. This is not a primary strategy. It is an available tool. Number 2, California. 9.2 on any rational restrictiveness scale. Title 24 energy standards require that any new thermal system installed in a residence meet prescriptive efficiency requirements that earth tube systems, as currently certified, do not satisfy. CE QSA review for soil disturbance in designated sensitive areas adds a permitting layer that can extend timelines by 18 months. The per incident civil penalty structure, $1,000 per day for code violations, is actively enforced in coastal counties. The cracks exist, as they always do in large states. Agricultural exemptions in Siskiyou, Modoc, and Lassen counties are genuinely powerful. The tiny home on wheels classification, which removes a structure from residential building code jurisdiction entirely, works statewide. Northern and eastern counties have dramatically reduced enforcement capacity. California is the most restrictive state for this specific application. It is also large enough that the rules bend at the edges. Number 1. Michigan. This entry surprises people, and the reason it surprises people is that Michigan does not advertise its energy code enforcement posture. The state adopted the 2021 IECCUC on an accelerated timeline and simultaneously restructured its residential plan review process to require energy code compliance documentation for any permit application involving below-grade construction, including applications that would otherwise be classified as minor work. The frost line depth in Michigan ranges from 36 to 48 inches depending on county, which means any compliant earth tube inlet or outlet structure must extend to a depth that triggers mandatory frost protection review. That review requires soil-bearing capacity documentation in the Upper Peninsula's clay-heavy soils, adding a geotechnical consultation that routinely costs $4,000 to $6,000. The rural exemption is narrow and specifically excludes thermal systems from its scope under a 2023 amendment to the State Construction Code. On the map, the pattern that emerges across all 5 states is identical to the pattern in every other category of preparedness regulation this channel has documented. Urban cores are restrictive. Rural peripheries are permissive. The law on paper and the law as enforced are frequently 2 different documents. The agricultural exemption remains the single most powerful legal tool available. In dozens of states, parcels with documented agricultural activity, beekeeping, a small orchard, a registered Christmas tree operation, even a market garden with sales receipts, qualify for agricultural classification that exempts structures from residential building codes, relaxes below-grade construction requirements, and in several states explicitly carves out thermal installations for agricultural use from energy code compliance entirely. The acreage threshold is lower than most people assume. 3 to 5 acres with documented production activity is sufficient in many jurisdictions. The documentation requirement is not onerous. Sales receipts, a county agricultural tax assessment on file, photographs with timestamps. The record tells a story. This is a working property, not a residential lot with an unpermitted installation. That story matters if you ever have to tell it to a building official. The temporary structure classification is the second pathway. Below-grade installations that do not involve a permanent foundation, inlet and outlet structures mounted on surface-level platforms rather than poured footings, fall outside the definition of a permanent structure in most code frameworks. No permanent structure means no building permit. No building permit means no energy code compliance review. The trade-off is durability and weather exposure at the termination points. It is a real trade-off. For people who need a functional system before next winter, it is an acceptable one. The county shopping strategy is the simplest and most underutilized. Colorado caps rainwater at 110 gallons. Wyoming, 90 miles north, has 0 restrictions. California caps portable fuel storage at 5 gallons in some jurisdictions. Nevada's enforcement is dramatically lighter. In states where county-level administration governs code enforcement, the difference between adjacent counties can be the difference between a $30,000 permitted project and a $290 weekend build. If you have not yet purchased land, the most impactful single decision you will make is choosing the right county, not the right state, the right county. One necessary note before we close. Nothing in this video is legal advice. Laws change. Enforcement varies by county, by city, sometimes by the individual inspector at your door. The regulatory landscape described here reflects publicly available code documents and enforcement records as of early 2026. Before making any significant construction or preparedness decision, consult a licensed attorney and a licensed contractor in your specific jurisdiction. What this video is thorough. And what exists in the fine print of residential energy codes, the quiet removal of exemptions, the expansion of permit triggers, the elevation of civil penalty structures, should concern every person who believes that heating their own home is a decision that belongs to them. The warmth beneath your feet has always been there. It belongs to the physics of the earth, not to a utility company and not to a building department. The question is whether you will know how to access it legally before the next grid failure makes the question urgent. Ignorance of the law has never been a defense. Awareness of it has always been a strategy.